I was very privileged to be invited by UHR, Matthew Knight, as president, to write a paper about this very topic. And what was supposed to be a short, almost a provocation piece, became, as I started to do a little bit of sleuthing with members of both the UHR Executive Committee and beyond, also fellows in the ODHE network, I was truly amazed at the extent of really good practice relevant to this. So I'm afraid, I apologise in advance, that what was supposed to be a short provocation piece became a rather longer piece, which, as I say, I hope you'll find useful when you get it. Because what I want to set forth is, in a way, having heard all day some fabulous plenaries and some really great breakout sessions, I think what I'm going to be saying is sort of summarising a lot of what you've heard already, so forgive me if that is the case. But I take slight differences of stance. I'm using the privilege of not being in the sector to be able to make sweeping observations which may not be true, but I'll welcome the debate later. For instance, this, as we know, we talked about the white paper, putting students at the heart of higher education. And Eric Thomas this morning was saying, you know, it's evolution just speeded up sort of thing. And I would argue, actually, even though there's the questions about, well, what's the vision like for the sector 10 years from now, I would argue it's highly unlikely that there will be any other vision for the sector, given that the economic policy that underpins all this has been the same consistently since 1985 or whatever it is. It's market freedoms that underpin this principle, you know, reduced state funding for state institutions, control by regulation, so that, you know, it may not appear top-down, but in fact you're working within the constraints set within the system, and it's think or swim within that. So to a large extent, I don't know why I'm smiling about that, but to a large extent it would be natural that there won't be a corresponding grand vision of what the future looks like, because part of what this is about is to commodify white-collar work and also to commoditize it to generate income. And as we've already heard, the output of universities is hugely important to UK GDP growth. So the tuition fees issue obviously has put better student experience now, in theory, should be on every institution's agenda. But again, my sleuthing seems to suggest that institutions are not homogeneous in this. As you all know better than me, the higher education sector falls into a variety of interesting categories. Not everybody operates within those categories the same as everybody else in the same categories, but by and large, the issue about how to embrace the student experience agenda is taken to a greater or lesser extent seriously in some institutions than others. And what I'm saying, I should have prefaced my remarks by saying, of course, in the devolved administrations, things are, you have your own particular challenges and pressures, but I would argue that, I guess, at least some of the pressures are going to be similar. So again, it would be interesting to have a debate on that a bit later. So we know that as well, HEFCE is under this this package of reforms going to have a much beefed up interventionist role. So to some extent, the degree of institutional autonomy to decide its own fate will be questionable, especially if you are not complying with some of the requirements around efficiency and value for money, and increase the competition in a sector, and inevitably you, to some extent, have to work to shorter-term agendas and seek opportunities where you may. So, as I say, that's a slightly different take, perhaps, on the sector, which, for me, serves as a sort of backdrop to what's going on, and why I think it's actually a very, very challenging climate within which institutions are operating, and why I think, given the slow evolution of higher education from its earlier stages in the UK to now, where we've, as Eric this morning said, in the last 20 years, there have been many, many different changes in higher education. I would say that the current stage of evolution of higher education seems to me to be one in which there's a confluence of a variety of strands that have happened in almost single strands earlier, and that the speed of change is probably going to be hotter. And coincidentally, I think the same can be said of HR as well. If you say that HR was formed in 1983 or something, well, it was in fact in the 1980s, as we know, that human resources as a discipline came into being, and as a functional offering, as an offshoot of managerialism. Then you could argue that these are two periods of two separate evolutions coming together, hopefully in a way that one can help the other, because there's no doubt that the reforms for essentially very knowledge-intensive businesses require deep expertise in knowing how to get the best out of knowledge-intensive people in a context where the game is changing all the time and where the speed is hotting up. Just some of these issues about measurable outcomes, about employability and so on. Sorry, that should have moved on. Aha. Looking at some of the responses. So across the organisations, and I would again preface my remarks by saying most of what I'm talking about in terms of the case material has been developed based on kind professionals, mostly in this room, I suspect, who spent time on the phone with me being interviewed about various aspects of this changing scene. And so can I invite those who were interviewed or who, when I talk about these things, know better, to just say, actually, it's like such and such. But what I've found in talking with various parties in the sector is that, as I said, the ways in which people are attempting to embrace the student experience agenda vary tremendously, but most institutions are aware that they need to adapt and adapt quickly. And there is a growing awareness of the need to get ahead of the next curve of change, which for me is agility. It's when you're anticipating what's coming next and you're getting speedy decision-making and implementation in preparation for that. I've come across in those conversations many universities seeking to distinguish themselves in terms of their mission, some of them going back to their core, some of them really trying to refocus very strongly on what they consider their core academic agenda. And others are going for new markets. Many are trying to seize their share of the AAB or the ABB to come markets. So they're all taking strategic decisions, whether it's behind closed doors or on a wider scale, about how to respond in this environment strategically. Internationalization is obviously a big thing for many institutions, and by that it's not just about addressing the issues of caps on students coming from overseas to study here, but it's setting up bases in some cases in other countries or working in partnership with other providers, and also trying to create a more multicultural environment back here that makes institutions welcoming. Most of the institutions are keen to manage some sort of culture change, and although there was a slight split in some of the commentary between the notion that it's culture change because actually people are totally resistant to change, and particularly the academics, and therefore, we're going to have to fix that problem. And the opposite, in a way, a more positive, proactive sense that actually if we could find a way to unlock people's willingness here, we could really retain the best of what works as well as move to what's required for us now. The Diamond Report and these efficiency savings we've heard about, that seems to be an underlying theme that you can count on. I think in this fast-changing scene, efficiency savings, even if it sounds as if the sector as a whole has got, still plenty of money floating around, that there will be an attempt to find new ways of working, new structures, and certainly the proposal for shared services, whilst it seems to be first in things like facilities management or procurement or whatever, I would have thought is inevitably going to come the way of HR. And indeed, it's part of the reason, I think, why UHR were interested in saying, well, let's find out what HR is currently doing that actually is advancing sustainability and survival in this context, so that we can at least make other people aware of this before we all get shoved into transactional boxes. So, if that's some of the institutional responses, I've found that what people have been telling me is that there are lots and lots of issues and challenges that you could call people and organisational challenges around those responses. So therefore, HR is ideally placed to make a difference here. So take the student experience agenda. There is no doubt that whatever people in the sector think, that already the penny has dropped with students and their parents in particular, that they want something for their money. I mean, there was an article in the FT not long ago, which was full of quotes. I don't know if you saw it. Here's just one. Quote from a parent: "We were appalled at the slapdash nature of my son's written work and the lack of feedback. Just 2 or 3 lines scrawled at the bottom of an essay with no pointers as to how to improve it. The waste of hope and potential still makes me angry. Is it worth £9,000 a year to be left to sink or swim," etc. So, and that was just sort of typical. So in a way, this, even talking about students as customers in many institutions, seems to be a very alien concept and an inappropriate concept. In fact, there was a debate about that, the question about, should we really be thinking about students as customers? Who are they to know, in a way? As well as, students who may not like the way in which they are set challenging tasks and then tweet each other about that rotten lecturer, when the rotten lecturer might be the one person who could get them through the exams. So there are some real dilemmas here, but nevertheless, some institutions are recognising that for them, the shift is no longer we select students who want to come to us, but we're in the active recruitment and trying to get students on board. And the International Student Barometer, as well as the NSS and so on, argue that it is not just good quality teaching and learning that students want these days, particularly international students who may or may not have other needs. It's the hygiene factors. It can be the janitor who is friendly and knows that person's name, who makes all the difference to the quality of that student's experience. And the questions that have been raised is, how do we get the message across about this? Because we're not sure that the importance of this agenda to our future income, to the viability of courses, again, taking the Diamond Report and the efficiency savings, increasingly the kind of cross-subsidisation that Eric was talking about earlier may or may not continue in this context. It may well be that courses that can't attract huge numbers and don't appear to have high employability issues. Jane and I were talking about classicists. Whilst it's obviously a critical discipline, you could argue, in terms of mental development, it may not immediately lead to employability. So this issue about how widely is the need for change recognised and how to balance priorities. Research has been top of the frame for so long. Teaching has always, in some institutions, seemed a bit of a poor relation. In research-intensive institutions, other institutions have majored on the teaching experience and have very high quality teaching. And now with REF and so on, it's going to be a question of how do we do both, not either or, as was always the case, but even more, how do we get excellence in both? How do we raise standards as well? Because it's probably going to mean that researchers will have to do things slightly differently as much as everybody's got to be able to teach in different ways. And then the issues about developing institutional agility. In the debate that I was party to at the UHR committee, there was even the point raised about, is it reasonable to expect that higher education institutions should be thought of as agile? You know, it's sort of built into the statute book that they're not. And yet, arguably, you can have processes and governance which seems laborious, but you can still have a different way of thinking which is anticipatory and which also has the ability to take anticipation, as I said earlier, into strategic choice and galvanizing activity and skilled implementation around that choice. So I think there is a big dilemma around that, because a lot of the people I was talking to were saying, well, actually, in this context, everybody's battening down the hatches. Again, sorry to keep on referring to talks this morning, but the issue that actually institutional leaders have just focused on their own neck of the woods. You know, there isn't necessarily, and they are the ones who set the strategy, so there's not necessarily, much sharing of thinking. And in a competitive environment, that's likely to be an ever-growing feature. The other slight point, which I've allowed myself a reflection on, I don't know if it's true, but my modest experience of academe would suggest that actually the very skills that academic leaders particularly have spent a lifetime developing, you know, deductive reasoning, evidence, peer review, etc., are the very skills that if you get to VC, you've learned to be risk averse in a way, and if anything, want more evidence before you move, which is actually not that helpful in the context of agility and bringing other stakeholders with you. It may not actually cause great people skills to be developed. And then if you take the other obvious ways in which there are people implications, the business about how do we attract and retain, and most importantly, engage the right workforce, which we've been talking about. There are issues to do with, yes, here too, I believe I don't know the exact split, but there is an aging academic workforce at least. And although the ending of the default retirement age probably means that many of them will be around till they're 95, it does raise the issue about, well, okay, are you going to be using performance management as a tool to ease those who can no longer cut it, as it were? More importantly, or as importantly, there are issues to do with career development for early stage academics as well, who, if you take the stereotypes as red, which is not the right thing to do, of course, but if you take Generation Y and even Z, they have, maybe with Generation Z, it's been sort of beaten out of them now, but generation, the net generation, are going to expect more rapid career development, perhaps. So how do you respond to that? Where do you get the new talent from? If you take, for example, international researchers, for example, or international academics, with the current caps and the excellent lobbying work that's going on by UUK and so on, it sounds as if there might be some releasing of the tension around this. But there seem to be both blockages in terms of recruiting new international talent and question marks about whether some of the new young talent that might come through homegrown, whether anybody's really going to fancy an academic career if they're lumbered with a massive student loan in future. So there are potentially issues around this. And so perhaps the biggest issue is for those who've been around the sector for some time, for whom this is a period of massive change, one in which they are going to be expected to perform more, faster, better, arguably, then the question is, how do you re-engage those people? Well, over to UHR, I would argue that this is where HR has a critical role to play. The biggest thing, I think, that came out of all these discussions I've been having is about the change in the culture of institutions, which one HR director and the UHR committee actually said this, unnamed. And, you know, if you take into account that a lot of people go to work in universities because they're not necessarily motivated by commercial motives. For many of them, this is quite a shift in their psychological contract, which is quite tricky. That and the changing academic career, you know, you've got this new breed of posts coming in, which are sort of quasi-academic stroke support, stroke managerial. So there is a big shift for people, and therefore the question is, what is the distinctive contribution HR can make in this? Well, Mike Moore, is he here today? Ah, yes, Mike. Apologies, I'm quoting you here, and I think this is absolutely true. HR has to be jacks of all trade, able to work fluidly across the spectrum from operational, even tactical, through to strategic, and also to be highly influential, because this is the agenda on which we should be moving on. And as I said earlier, there was grave concern expressed by a number of the people I was interviewing about the extent to which HR is so driven down the operational agenda and required to respond on all sorts of things that you know, keep them away from the strategic agenda. People feel in danger of the potential HR contribution being wasted. So forgive me, I'm just going to do a few quick theory slides just to say where I think there's very encouraging news from within the sector. So if you take the McKinsey value triangle, and look at value for money, that's the question of how much is HR, what HR is doing, fit for purpose. Well, I can report that almost everybody I spoke with was trying to restructure HR in one way or another for strategic impact. But it wasn't just restructuring for its own sake, it was for strategic impact. So what was really encouraging was that many of the HR teams reported to me were doing things that added value in their different contexts. I'll break them down shortly. Some were more directly doing things that created value, created that context where people do want to come and work in the sector, where students are getting a fantastic experience, and where the brand of the institution is being reinforced. And in many ways, what I found was that Ulrich and Brockbank's 2005 theory was amply illustrated by people in this room. So it's great when practice and theory actually go together. You know, so there were examples of human capital development, lots of emphasis on staff development, and you know, the spreading of innovation, opportunities to really think about capturing knowledge and turning it into something valuable for the institution. Lots of examples of strategic partnering. In fact, almost everybody I spoke to used the word working in partnership with top management. And given that that's such a phrase that's used at institutional level, I think that's probably a very appropriate word. It's not got the dirty word connotation that it developed in the NHS. So that's largely around HR helping on the, not helping, but in some cases shaping the change agenda and managing a lot of the implementation. Also, I mentioned already, the functional expertise, fit for purpose, improving some of the core processes like recruitment and getting them you know, much more efficient as well as effective. And also lots of examples of employee advocacy, emphasis on employee engagement, and not only academic staff, but more generally, issues to do with good developing constructive employee relations and careers. And just to carry on with the theory, my own little tiny emphasis that I would want to add to Ulrich is the emphasis on seeing the organisation as well as the individuals as where HR leaders should focus. This, for me, the capability to build organisational culture and to build organisational capabilities, what is it you're going to need to be good at in years to come, even if it's only sharing innovative ideas and doing something with it. I argue this is something that in the past has not been HR's particular area of strength. But what I've found is that there are people in this room who have, walked the talk in respect to this and are showing, if you like, what a difference organisation development can make when you embrace culture change and you have a more systemic view of things and you're good at using things like high involvement methodologies. So it's about shifting the performance curve to, I hate these terms, maximise human value, but you know what I mean in your context. And again, what has been really interesting is almost everybody, whether they're an OD specialist, an HRD specialist, or HRM specialist, almost everybody I've spoken to has picked this first point, it was moving from reacting to proacting. I won't attempt to go back, otherwise we'll be here all day. So it, again, is this anticipatory thing, and it's having the confidence to try and shift thinking. It's about creating a people and organisational mission for the business, not an HR agenda. It's about ensuring the organisation has the right talent in the right place at the right time and transforming the institution to ensure it meets its full potential. And again, I'm just trying to give you reassurance that I found these are Ulrich and all the other co-authors of, he does this regular survey of HR competencies, and over the years he's been doing it. Ulrich's always said, HR is just not good at the culture and change steward. They just don't get into that space. They're not good at strategy architect, etc. And what he was saying in 2007 was that those 4 top capabilities, if you like, competency areas as he calls them, are worth 75% of the value of an HR professional's contribution. Well, I found plenty of examples of that in what I was looking at. And almost at the end of the theory piece, what was also interesting, again, this links with some more recent theory about organisational effectiveness, which is trying to say, in this changing world, where we may not have a clear vision for the future, even though it would be quite nice, perhaps, and where we have a lot of complication, complexity, paradox, ambiguity, what's the kind of role of leaders and leadership, and in particular of HR, in preparing people to survive and thrive in a sustainable way in that context? And so I'm arguing that HR need to be in there, in this space, shaping people's thinking about what does organisational effectiveness look like for us. And being aware of language, the language they use. The little tease I did at one conference a couple of years ago when we were starting work on this was to ask a CIPD audience at the annual conference. There were 160 people in this room, and my colleague said, how do you define added value? And people chatted for a few minutes, and they came back with all their suggestions. And everybody had contributed. Out of that 160 people and all these fancy responses, how many times do you think employee was mentioned? Well, it was 3 times, actually, so that's something. But I'm just arguing that we have to be careful. Our priorities, if you're a discourse theorist, which I'm sort of, if you're a discourse theorist, what you prioritise is reflected in your language. I've always said we should be business people first and foremost and bring our expertise, our functional expertise, to play. That's our added value. But I think you can go too far with this as well. And I think now is the period where we need to go deep dive into how do we re-engage people? How do we get to grips with what the changing psychological contract might be for key workers in our institutions? How do we help involve people in contexts where they may not be very happy with what's happening, but you still vitally depend on them for your outcomes? So I'm arguing that there needs to be authenticity, transparency, there needs to be a genuine embracing of win-win outcomes here, genuinely trying to go for mutuality, which in the context I painted earlier, the dominant assumptions of neoliberalism and unitarism, which is how we are now, is that what's good for the business is good for the people. And of course, that's not true when things are tough. So it's how do you get some degree of mutuality into the offer, develop employee value propositions that really are meaningful, and at the same time be real world and recognise that there is a lot of efficiency that's required, and it's not all about giving everybody everything. Paradox and ambiguity, how do you cope with it? Leadership and management, what do you need in the form of leadership and management for the future? And basically, that's just a little old chart that suggests that a lot of people were concerned that HR in the sector as a whole is perceived to be in the works hard but not smart, and not enough at the right-hand end of the influence continuum. I'm saying I think that's where you need to be. And as I said, I was delighted, and I'm just about to start now going through some of the things that I found, and that you can read at great length. As I mentioned, it wasn't 20 pages in the end, it was more like 40 or 50, I think. Some of the examples of really great practice out there. Now, so first of all, I've tried to group these into categories of activity. And so what were people doing? What was the distinctive contribution that HR was making in the sector? So I'll just give you a few little snippets, because you can read more about it later, if you so wish. First of all, aligning HR efforts with the vision of the organisation, actually being a critical part of the business strategy. For instance, supporting the internationalisation agenda. If you take Glasgow University, for example, if I may quote Ian and his colleagues, Glasgow was coming from a fairly low base in terms of international students and staff at one stage. And they've made a very determined effort to internationalise in a number of different ways, both through developing strategic partnerships in different parts of the world. Some of those were sort of opportunistic, ex-alumni who happened to be senior players in different parts of the world, but some are quite strategic in that, they've gone after them and they're building them. But most particularly, they've done a range of different things to try and make Glasgow, coming, as I say, from a slowish start in this relative to other comparable institutions, a welcoming place to be. So they've worked closely not only with the border agency, but with all the tourist agencies. They've done a bespoke Lonely Planet guide for students, etc. They've worked as much on attracting people in as retaining them. So they provided website resources for incoming staff that and for outbound staff as well, that are tailored to the specific needs, so it's fit for purpose. They've even provided practical help to incoming staff on things like, well, how do you get an email address set up? Right down to helping with, basic concerns about how do I get my kids into schools and so on. Supporting the academic agenda I'll come back to, but supporting the student experience agenda. In particular, this issue about working back, the theory is at the moment, it's about working back from where, if you take Ulrich for a start, working back from the customer. What does the customer need from you? Well, if you took the notion that student is customer, and again, I went to a very interesting session just now on Canada and Australia's take on that. It's about working back and saying what does HR need to be doing in terms of devising roles and building managerial capacity, etc., to focus on this agenda. How do we restructure for strategic impact? University of Central Lancashire is a good example of this, where they have, if you like, dealt with their transactional services remodelling. They've got very clear strategic roles and roles that are part strategic. They've moved into the anticipatory roles, so they're really good at workforce planning. They're great at following up on staff surveys so that the actions actually work. They got into organisation redesign and restructuring. They've helped in developing new international campus. They're increasing research and knowledge transfer capability. They've introduced, etc., etc. I mean, as I say, I'm just saying that when you do restructure with something in mind, it's really powerful if then you are better able to do it. Restructuring for strategic impact is typically about this. It's about working to turn the whole of HR into a strategic partnership. Obviously, you've got to get the basics right, but it's with the big moves in mind as well. You can't do the big moves without getting the basics right, and getting the right metrics as well. Making sure that HR itself is fit for purpose in terms of its own capability and its own development. And a lot of the people I was talking to were very focused on developing the capability of their own team and recruiting in the right capability. And very much developing the people plan collaboratively. And so I won't go into this next example. Sorry, I was just going to give an example of one institution that has done that, but in fact it was covered well in a session earlier. And Jane Bilham, University of Lincoln, again, we've developed a people strategy, not an HR strategy. It's not about the HR department doing HR. Again, it's this notion that this is a shared effort. So how amenable, open are your management and leadership to working in partnership with you, if you like? So it's about acting as change agent, working closely with change leaders, looking back and ahead and so on. And again, a characteristic of all the people I spoke with was, and it goes back to a question someone asked after a session this morning, you know, how do you avoid just having to relearn stuff? Almost everybody that I spoke to had a set of learnings that they'd taken from things that they'd done, whether it was driven through crisis or whether it was something they'd done because they felt it was needed. Aiming to increase agility. Now, sparing Naomi's blushes, a really interesting case, it was interesting to me, and I'm sure you'll find it so, is the work that Naomi has been very pivotal to at the University of Hertfordshire, working in partnership there with the Secretary and Academic Registrar, to introduce agile structures in a particular part of the institution. It was about simplifying things and getting people refocused on the academic task. It was about shifting the culture as well to be more open to the idea of high performance and so on. But the way Naomi went about it, sorry, as I say, this is very embarrassing for you, but was, in my view, a great example of developing a really participative change process. So this issue about, yes, the VC wanted, in fact, announced anybody who wants to take part can do so. But actually the way the process worked and working closely with the unions throughout has been a case study for the sector, I think, in how to do it, even though it's not straightforward as nothing is, but it's really moving forward. So there was an example of an institution not crisis-driven, quite the contrary, trying to bring about greater agility and already seeming to be able to do that. Lots of benefits coming from that. And similarly, University of West of England, different case study altogether. Again, major restructurings, trying to introduce greater performativity, but very much driven by a set of principles, one university principles, which helped create that coherence in what was happening. Sheffield Hallam has virtual project teams to work with other change leaders and provide the kind of support that they need. So it's around, checking out, what are the various parts of the institution that you're about to kind of do change with? What is it that is going to affect them most? How can you use your expertise to get ahead of the curve and to prepare to work in as much as you can high involvement ways? Because for me, that's around how you mobilize people for change, particularly shared values as the basis of culture change. Sorry, I'm in a state of panic now because I've got several more slides to go, and I think I'll probably have to wrap up to allow time for some questions. But again, Professor Dawn Freshwater of the University of Leeds, very clear about if you want culture change, you have to lead from the top. You can't have the top disappearing over the horizon and letting everybody else change their behaviour. It's very much around deliberately making the effort to role model things, role model the values that you're trying to put across. And absolutely everybody I spoke to said if you're trying to bring about culture change, whether it's to be more student-centric or whether it's to become more agile, whatever it is, you must have sustained top-level commitment. Without it, you're really up a gum tree, metaphorically speaking. It's much, much harder. And again, clues in the case studies featured in this little report, how many of them have gone the high involvement ways, working with staff bodies and trades unions as part of that, but very much looking to do high involvement methodologies. There's a nice little case study based on another report that DMU did, which was a variation on the change process known as World Cafe. They used a vision cafe that HR engaged staff in. A very successful way of getting people on board with the change that was needed. And enhancing the student experience, well, interestingly, there are two people in this room at least, who have or are currently both HR director and academic registrar. So they see things from both the student angles very clearly and staff angles. And one of the people who wears that cap pointed out that you can directly affect employability, student employability, in all sorts of ways. The examples he gave me were at Winchester, where HR team, on student open days at certain times of the year, run the careers advisory equivalent of speed dating and provide, work closely with the media studies department, provide role model type interview practice and so on. But mostly HR works indirectly with this agenda, and obviously the biggest thing around that is attracting and retaining the right staff. And here we get to, that's both about getting the right processes like recruitment fit for purpose. There's a super case study in there about what's happening at Northumbria University to improve the recruitment processes. So HR has very much led this initiative. It's resulted in a talent pool that here the focus for this particular initiative is not just for academic, this is more for entry-level academic posts. So they built a talent pool of candidates such that when they have posts available, rather than having to advertise separately for each post, they have a pool from which they can draw. Massively efficient, and the quality of feedback that the candidates get is second to none, so everybody wins. Lots of examples about performance management. Everybody's embracing this agenda. Lots of examples particularly around how to re-engage employees by providing them with development. Imperial are doing some great things about coaching. They built up a coaching academy. Initially, it was attached to a particular leadership program, and the people who emerged from that program had the opportunity to be trained as coaches and be accredited as coaches, and now the offer is more widely available, for example. And incidentally, as I probably will have to wrap up in a minute, Imperial also have the fortunate, or I don't know if it's fortunate or unfortunate, challenge of having 2,000 postdocs and careers for those people. Obviously, it is quite an issue. Some of them may stay on and become members of staff. Again, there's some really interesting work where working with those postdocs, processes have been designed and networks have been designed to enable postdocs to really engage with the organisation and, if you like, become part of the staff side without being staff members. Well-being, in particular, is a key aspect of this engagement agenda. And for what it's worth, I was involved in some research last year on employee engagement, and the first thing I did was just try and read every available study I could get my hands on employee engagement, and then try to crunch it all down, what the different survey providers say, etc. And actually, when I looked at it initially, it seemed very simplistic, because the top three blobs, that if you look at Gallup or any of the main Towers Perrin, Towers Watson, or whatever it now is. What they're all saying is people are engaged to some extent, usually with their work, if they have the three blobs at the top satisfied. So is my mind intellectual? Have I got a job that interests me? Can I grow in it? Is it something that I feel is worthwhile? Is it social? Is it something that I feel good to be part of? Am I engaged in the mission or whatever of this organisation? Do I have a best friend at work? Was an old Gallup one, wasn't it? And emotional is a very heavy element of this. How do I feel about this place? Do I like it? Do I feel valued? You know, all the minute things that can affect that's a really powerful thing. So that top three blobs was developed by Kahn in about 1999, I think. But we've added, co-author and me, these two principles here that they're good work principles from the Work Foundation, and John Budd also writes a lot about this, that those top three tend to be okay if nothing else changes. But actually, things are changing all the time. And these principles at the bottom, voice in particular, because people now realise there's no job for life, and you're messing around with people's jobs. So they do want to know what's going on. So voice is two-way. It's both being informed and all the communication processes that goes with that, as well as having a say and being heard. So what are the processes? This is why I keep on saying high involvement, finding means of funneling information through, feeding information up. I don't mean about necessarily individuals, but making sure that the top knows how people are feeling. And developing the mechanisms for that. Equity or fairness, again, you can't regulate for everybody feeling the same way about things. And I'm not talking here about equality, even though equality and diversity is obviously hugely important to gender. Actually, equity seems to be more generically the principle that upsets people, because if they feel unfairly treated, all the rest of it goes to pot. And it's those two that seem to determine whether you trust the organisation or not. So again, University of College of Central Lancashire, great communications, Lincoln, permanent management roles. I know the university sector is not the same on this, but they have turned rotational roles into permanent roles to try and make it possible for managers to take the engagement agenda more seriously. Sheffield doing fantastic stuff around well-being, creating or they're planning to launch some of this stuff. They've taken what they're doing already. They're using staff surveys to understand what really matters to people, and then they're making a more coherent offer that can be tailored to people via a website to offer bespoke offerings. Just so that you know, this little model, which you won't be able to read unless you're Houdini, is where we, my colleague and I, work this up into something else, which is basically saying if you want engagement with the organisation as opposed to just with the job, because this morning, if you remember, it was people were saying, well, people love their job often in the university sector, but they don't really much like the organisation. Well, that's certainly true in, say, parts of the NHS. And the issue being that if they don't engage with the organisation, they're usually less willing to change because their paradigm is their job. So there's something around voice again, as I said there, having some means of connecting with the organisation at an emotional level. How do you develop that sense of shared purpose? And again, I think it is around involvement that is true, and great communication, great role modelling. Support, again, how good are your line managers, who may or may not be rotational, at supporting people, treating them as individuals, etc., enabling them, providing them with the basic skills to do the job. And that last bit, scope, which I think is probably the most important thing, that's people's sense of autonomy, freedom, but also having parameters within which their expected output is clear and having a chance to kind of nibble away at that. So I would argue that HR has a pretty key role to play in all of those. Well, I am terribly sorry because there is more here, but I have exceeded my sell-by date, and all I can say is feel free to read the doc, and you will get the tail end of the presentation thrown in. So I think there's about 5 minutes left, Naomi.
I think you've illustrated why we've got a document of 50 pages
Yes.
rather than 30 pages. There is about 5 minutes if there are any questions. I would like people to leave the room without the chance to ask Linda questions. There's roving microphone. No? Yes?
It's on, is it? Linda, if we had one sentence that you could sum up the HR difference, what would it be for universities?
You mean what I think it is?
Yeah.
Look, if I've written 50 pages rather than 20, how am I going to do that in a sentence?
Imagine I'm going to tweet it in about 10 minutes' time.
Well, I think it's about being a strategic transformer with people at the heart of what you're doing.
Hope somebody got that.
And if I could offer one area that I think, in particular, you could be shaping debate on, it is this issue. I mean, I may be exaggerating based on the conversations I've had, but the impression I have is that there are quite a lot of unhappy people around in the sector at the moment. And I think this agenda of the changing academic, not only the academic roles, and the psychological contracts, particularly for people who've been in the sector for some time, unless it's about changing all the people because you can't change the people, I would argue HR should be leading on revising openly and transparently with people, working in partnership with the staff, to think through what does that new psychological contract need to be. Because I think people are grown up and, you know, they'll welcome the chance to participate, and I think HR should be leading that.
Any further questions?
Oh, I see.
Hi Linda, Claire Sutherland from Catapult Consulting. What recommendations would you have based on your experience for promoting emotionally intelligent leadership in our universities?
Again, it's not an easy agenda, and I should add that whilst I think emotional intelligence is a crucial skill, I am slightly sceptical as well about. I wouldn't say, well, you know, this is the only thing, but I do think it's an aspect of leadership where I was referring earlier to a stereotype of how academic leaders have conventionally developed their academic gongs, as it were. The skill set attached to that doesn't usually involve deep faith in intuition or self-awareness on any grand scale. So I think it is an area where HR needs to be looking at the calibre of current leadership and actually doing something about it. But more particularly where I didn't get to, which is the forward agenda, it's sort of really beefing up in succession planning and workforce planning some of the skills that are going to be needed, not, you know, because this is the basis of resilience as well, you know, and you can guarantee it's not going to be plain sailing or the same, even in a year's time. So, you know, it's more of a future agenda, but right now the leadership agenda, I think, is go and, you know, give feedback, brave decision, minister time, and for what it's worth, I know that there was an interview again with Dave Ulrich, which I saw the other day, and he was arguing that it's probably the most important agenda that HR should be tackling now, and it's the least tackled agenda, because it's, again, you know, it takes guts to challenge your own VC and to give feedback. For what it's worth, my own HR leadership research found in other sectors that the very few people, out of all the people I know in HR, the very few people I saw as genuine HR leaders, all had that kind of coaching relationship with the equivalent of the VC. They kept the worst excesses away, at least, of the damage that could otherwise be done by people lacking emotional intelligence or not understanding how to tackle particular issues without exacerbating the situation. So, thank you.
Put your hand up now. Oh, right, we'll make that the last one then.
Hi, Johnny Gifford from Roffey Park.
Oh.
You mentioned, you cited someone talking about HR needing a people strategy rather than HR strategy. And I'm sure we can all sort of feel that difference and identify with that statement. I wonder if you could give us an example of that differentiates that. And I suppose I wouldn't ask you to name and shame anyone by pointing out a blatant sort of HR strategy. So perhaps you could give an example of a very good people strategy that sort of differentiates itself in that sense.
Yes, and again, when I say HR strategy, I'm stereotyping it to imply something off-centre that is attached, aligned to the business strategy somewhere, but is largely reactive and measures output in terms of status quo as much as anything. Whereas the people strategy, I'd argue, is an integral aspect of the development of business strategy, so that you can actually build business strategy, ironically, from people strategy if you're looking at the kinds of capabilities you have as an organisation or are trying to develop, and then you can look at opportunities to develop those skills. You can actually grow business strategy from people strategy. It tends to have the development of organisational capability. So, there are particular aspects of collective skill sets we're trying to grow, like our ability to work in partnership with, the local authority or something. I can't think of a good example. And it tends to put investment into those areas whilst treating the operational HR aspects as subsets of that, which have to be tailored to that future as well as current focus. So you might switch some of the investment from your current HR strategy, your investment in development in X, to something else because you're developing this over time. And there are examples around the sector. I mean, I've put one or two mentions in the report. As I say, I think there's, from what I've seen, there's a good one at Lincoln. There's a good one at University College Lancaster. And I think, it's one of the hardest things to do, to come up with something that is succinct and can be operationalized in a way that makes sense to people. But it has to, in a sense, be a shared thing that is not just the HR's bag. It's a collective, management-wide thing, and where the business plans that flow from it, everybody understands why we're doing this and why engagement is important, for instance.